Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Who We've Become. Today, I have one of my old elementary school classmates, Blake Buchanan, on. We've known each other for what, almost 30 years now. And he's gone through some challenges throughout his life. And like our conversation with Drew last week, I wanted to bring some people on just to show everybody out there that we can all go through some tough times and we can all come out on the other side for the better if we just kind of stick together and share ideas, share our mindsets when we're going through some struggles, and hopefully help people out along the way. So, thank you all for being here. Good afternoon, Blake. How's it going, man?
Good. Excited to be on. I know we've kind of gone back and forth, but happy to speak with you.
Yeah, glad to be here. So, yeah, we've known each other for geez, almost 30 years, huh? Fifth grade?
Yeah, and it's funny
Is
you're
that
wearing
it?
that Red Sox sweatshirt because I distinctly remember you being a Seattle Mariners fan, and I don't know if that was just to
Yes.
piss me off because I was an Angels fan, but I definitely remember that.
No, it was actually because I was doing baseball during that time. So I was a big Randy Johnson fan.
Okay.
So that time he was with Seattle. And then when I really got into watching baseball a ton, that's when the Yankees were really the powerhouse. And I've always been an underdog guy. And so you got to root for the underdog team. There was the Red Sox. They kept getting screwed
That's
over by the
right.
Yankees. So I started to like them a little bit as a team holistically. And I just kind of carried that with me. So I've always been a Randy Johnson fan until he went to the Yankees. Then I was like, I really can't for for those couple of years. Really can't do it. But at the end of the day, yeah, I was always a big underdog fan, and they kept getting screwed over by the the Yankees, and now their path recently, we're in the bottom of the barrel just like you guys. So
Yeah.
Angels and Red Sox can stick together.
Yeah, my company that I just started with about 6 months ago is based right outside of Boston. We had our sales conference at Fenway, so I didn't get to see a game obviously because we're in the middle of winter, but it was exciting to see that building. There's a lot of history, so it's pretty cool.
Yeah, I went probably about like 6, 7 years ago. I went to Fenway with my dad. David Ortiz's last year, and we went to two games. We went to two games in August, and one of them was a day Sunday game, and something happened, and ESPN decided to take it over for the Sunday night game. So the tickets were still stupid cheap. So I got my mom to give me the access to the tickets that my dad had bought for the Sunday game. And I sold those tickets and then bought tickets right behind the dugout.
Oh,
So
nice.
David
Oh,
Ortiz's second to last home run, we got to see from the dugout, from right
that's
behind the
awesome.
dugout, which
That's
was pretty cool.
amazing.
Yeah, once in a
Cool.
lifetime thing, but it was pretty
Yeah,
cool.
yeah. I'll have
So
to go
tell me,
back there and
tell me, what have you been up to? What I know that you're living in what is it, Georgia now?
Austin, Texas.
Austin, Texas.
Yeah.
So what got you to kind of move from Southern California, Orange County over to Texas, and then tell me a little bit about your work, and then the struggle that you kind of ran into, and then when you kind of go through that, and then how you came out on the other side, we'll kind of sit there and chat about it.
Sure. So that's a long story. So stop me if I get boring. But
Yeah.
right after high school, I went to the University of Arizona and then graduated and moved to St. Louis. And I did a program called Teach for America in St. Louis, where if you're unfamiliar, the goal of that program is to go, it basically recruits college graduates that wouldn't otherwise teach to go teach in underserved public schools. So we taught in a district called Normandy School District, which is just north of St. Louis, and um, taught a lot of underserved children, and that was just an eye-opening experience, just mind-boggling. And I met my wife there. She would not date me for about 4 years. So I chased her for a long time. She is from Louisiana, so she ultimately moved to Louisiana, and I followed her without permission. And she finally took me
Ah,
in, and we started dating in New Orleans. So I was still teaching in New Orleans, and then ultimately kind of moved to a profession that I wanted to go to, just sales, right? So I started working for Enterprise, the rent-a-car company,
mhm,
and I worked there for about 10 years in Louisiana. I went through various departments, but finally landed in a department that they have called fleet management, which is a little different than rental cars. What a fleet management company does is they call on companies that have a fleet of vehicles and try to manage their vehicles. And I thought I was going to work at Enterprise for a long, long time, but then I got recruited to work for a competitor. And this was August of 2019. So, and that's kind of, I think, the goal of this podcast is to kind of talk about struggles and things that happen. And I think,
mhm.
up until that point, life was pretty gravy. I was happy, and not that I'm not happy now, but very happy with what was going on. And then um, our third child was born about 3 weeks after I started in the new company.
Mhm.
And with that new company, they required me to move to Texas, and they required me to move anywhere in Texas, but they gave me until January 1st of 2020. And we all kind of know what happened in 2020. So,
Oh
um,
yeah.
but my third child was born 3 weeks after I started at my new company, and they knew that going in, right? My wife's pregnant, we're going to have a baby, kind of expecting me to take like a week and get back to it. But unbeknownst to us, while he was in the womb, when he was born, he had a pretty severe heart condition. So the day he was born, nurses rushed him straight to the ICU. We still thought everything was going to be fine, but long story short, he required several surgeries to fix this thing. And when we moved to Austin, part of the reason we chose Austin, not only because it's a cool city, but they just happen to have the best pediatric heart surgeon in the world that happens to live in Austin, Texas.
So you got
So
lucky.
we kind of did it on purpose, right? Like he had started the Texas Children's in Houston is basically the biggest children's hospital in the world. So he started
Mhm.
the pediatric cardiology department there, and then and then basically started it in Austin as well at a hospital called Dell Children's. So he moved to Austin, started his practice there through that hospital, and we knew that going in that we wanted that to be our doctor because Augie required some open heart surgery and this, that, and the other. And so when we moved here, it was January of 2020. He was about what would that be, like 5 months old, and so
Yeah.
we're doing consultations, and you know they they had some sort of stop gaps in between getting open heart surgery because they wanted his heart to grow a little bit, and but anyway, once we saw Dr. Frazier, he was like, well, what I think we can probably get what needs to be done sooner than later. So he had surgery February 15th, I believe, and we closed on
Yeah.
our house on
My
the
birthday.
14th. Yeah, so we closed on our house February 14th of 2020, and he had surgery. I don't know if it was February 15th. It was close to that date, but he had surgery
Wow.
very shortly after. And then obviously COVID hit pretty
Yeah.
shortly after that, right? So his recovery required a couple weeks in the hospital, and it was like right in the middle of that time. Whereas in his previous hospital stays, we have two other kids that are older. One of us could bring him down. We could have dinner in the hospital and hang out, and we
Mhm.
could hang out in his room, whatever. And then COVID hits, and all of a sudden they're like one person at a time. Nobody else is even allowed through the hospital door. So you got to like trade off at the door. You got to wear a mask, all that stuff, which caused quite a bit of anxiety because we have two other kids. I'm trying to work. Jessica's trying to work. And we're just having to go back and forth. So basically, we had to take two kids, drive 40 minutes to the hospital, switch off in the parking lot. The other person would go in the room, spend the night because it wasn't like we could leave a 6 month alone
Oh yeah.
in the in the hospital. So it's happening, right? And at the time, you're like, oh man, this is a lot, but it just doesn't. It's just like on to the next thing, right? Like, and then uh, another. wall hit where I work in the automobile industry, obviously, and COVID just decimated our industry. I mean, it was just, I'm sure you've heard of the ups and downs of the car market and lack of production. And there was also a chip shortage. And it just really, really hit us pretty hard. And my company that I was working for was owned by Hertz, the rental car company, who, if you remember in COVID, Hertz had to file for bankruptcy. And
Right.
although my company, our balance sheet was pretty strong, but Hertz is just a huge behemoth of a company that we had to follow them into bankruptcy. So all of the contracts that I had going up
Oh,
until COVID, if they hadn't already put the stalls on because of COVID, then they put the stalls on because now the company that I work for is in bankruptcy. So
correct.
ultimately, about a year later, they got purchased by a private equity firm who then purchased one of our competitors. So we had a big merger, and I had 5 different managers in 2 years, and it was just it was very hard to be successful in those circumstances. Not that I want to make excuses, but I ultimately resigned, hopped around jobs a couple times through COVID. I kind of just yada 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 you there because there was a lot of other stuff going on, but ultimately landed on my feet about 6 months ago. I started with this new company. I absolutely love it. It's a competitor of the previous company that I was with, and but just very stable. Treats their employees well. The car market's kind of starting to settle down, and I'm seeing a lot more inquiries through the door and people willing to talk about their fleet. A lot of people need cars right now because they weren't able to purchase cars for a couple of years, and
Oh, yeah.
allocations finally starting to settle. So I kind of see the light at the end of the tunnel here, but it was certainly an interesting 3 years for sure.
Now, with when you were hopping kind of from job to job to job, like when you were doing that yada yada, like the
Mhm.
was your son still having like medical procedures, and did he still have to do follow-ups? How were you able, from a health insurance standpoint, from a familial standpoint, how were you guys able to kind of
The
balance
majority of
those?
yeah, I mean that's a good question. Jessica is a teacher, so she has pretty good health insurance, and we finally figured
Oh,
out like let's get all the kids on her insurance because they were on my insurance for a long time.
mhm.
And then, in addition, like the majority of the very expensive stuff was done by the time I made that first hop.
Oh, that's
So
good.
that wasn't as big of an issue. But I mean, he still has to go to a pretty decent cardiology appointment once a year. His little scar flares up every once in a while, so we have to go see the actual surgeon. But he hasn't had to do anything real serious since that surgery. Now, after the surgery, we were only expecting his hospital stay to be about 2 weeks, and it ended up being about 2 months because it got infected. So we were having to
Oh,
do that whole switcheroo thing that I was talking about for 2 months, and it was a lot. But luckily, we have some really good grandparents, and they were able to come and help a little bit, and so we got it figured out. But it was a lot, and it's like when you're living through times like that, it's like again, you don't really realize like how much you're going through until after it all happens. And then like at least for me, at the end of it, I was like, damn, that was a lot. Like we
yeah.
really went through a lot there. And then you kind of appreciate when things aren't quite as hectic. We can kind of sit down and get some stuff done.
Well,
Everybody's
yeah.
healthy.
And I could only imagine, I mean, from a health scare standpoint, when my middle son was born, he just he had a bad case of jaundice, and we had to keep him in the
Hmm.
hospital. We took him home. They let us take him home, and then we brought him back for testing, and he was still testing high. So we had to keep him under the black light, the UV light, for just a few hours. But even that
Yeah.
was tough on us, seeing a newborn like that. So I can only imagine
Hmm. Yeah.
emotionally the struggle, and how much you and your wife would need each other throughout that
Yeah.
process, considering the fact that it was right when your son was born. It wasn't like he was born and then,
Yeah.
oh, several months later they find this issue. It was like right
Right.
away for you guys, huh?
The night he was, and they put him in this little cocoon of a emergency vehicle and had to drive him 2 miles down the road to this other hospital because they actually had, what they needed to do to examine the child and make sure that they knew what was wrong.
Whew.
And so I'm sitting there, following the ambulance to the other hospital. It was crazy.
And your wife
So, I mean,
was,
that was just the first one, right?
and she
Yeah.
was still in the hospital bed, huh? Recovering
Yeah.
as
And
you
then,
were doing all
she,
this?
correct. Yes. And she lobbied to, get a sort of a early, dismissal or whatever you call it from the hospital. And she she only spent about 12 hours in the hospital after childbirth, which is very short,
Yeah.
and showed up the next day. And I went to the other hospital, showed up the next day worried about her kid. And I could just tell she was exhausted, and I was exhausted too. And it's just like, what do you do, right?
Yeah.
So then they did some cath procedures to kind of put a stent in the valve that had the issue. And that got him through like the first 6 months. And so after about the initial, I think he was in there for 2 months right after he was born, they let him out, but we still had to put a pulse ox on him 100% of the time, which is that little thing that they wrap around the baby's toe to make sure that they're getting enough oxygen in
Mhm.
their heart.
Yeah.
So his oxygen, I mean, normally a person's oxygen runs about 99 to 100% typically.
Right.
That's how much oxygen's in your blood. His was running like 70 to 80, which is pretty scary. So if it dips under, if it dips under 70, that's like sign for alert. But the problem was that little pulse ox thing doesn't stay on a baby's toe. So if it
Yeah.
goes off, the thing would just go "Rah, rah, rah," in the middle of the night, like
Oh,
every 30 minutes, like this thing would start buzzing. So like not only are you emotionally exhausted, but like you're physically exhausted because you're not getting sleep. It's just it was nuts. So
and how long from I mean, obviously, like you said, he still has a cardiologist appointment like once a year, but the how long
mhm.
was it from when he was born? How long was it before he was, I guess you could say, kind of in the clear, so to speak, from a doctor standpoint?
um
Like, how long did all the different procedures take before the doctor was like, okay, now he can get into this mode of just seeing us once a year and
yeah.
stuff like that?
I would say, let's see. So I think he got out officially after the infection in like April of 2020. So I'd say May when he was home for a couple weeks, like May of 2020. So it was pretty close to a year where we were really kind of back and forth, like, is this going to work? Since then, I mean, he's perfect. He's a complete wild ass. They're saying that he's going to have sort of a tune up when he gets a little older,
Hmm.
but they're kind of playing that by ear. But they're estimating when he's 9 or 10 years old, he'll have to go back into to kind of readjust some things. But all's all's well that ends well at this point. So no issues. I mean, every once in a while, you can kind of tell he's getting a little tired, like playing sports.
Uh,
He gets very overheated and he gets very cold because his heart's just not working 100%. I mean, it's there. He's not in any danger by any means, but you can just kind of tell like little things like he's not quite where his speech is hasn't developed, and that could just be third child, but it could also be because he had to go under anesthesia more than a dozen times, right? So
yeah.
the doctor was like that may cause some developmental issues, and we really haven't seen anything besides speech, and that can get fixed. We're pretty sure. So it's other than that, I mean, he's perfect. So.
And how did you, I mean, through that year, even or especially like towards the end with the job transition, how did you guys
Mhm.
as a married couple, how did you guys get through without freaking out and like chewing each other's heads off? I mean, I'm sure there was probably some stressful moments where you two kind of jumped at each other, but how ultimately, like at the end of the day, like what was your kind of everyday focus as you guys were just getting through the day-to-day process of work and new job and the kids you already had and
Mhm.
the procedures and stuff like that? Like what was your mindset during that whole time?
Well, it's weird because and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but like when it was going on, I didn't feel like overly stressed. Like I didn't feel like super overwhelmed. Like every once in a while I would like go into my room and be like, "Oh my God, I need a second. This is a lot." But like it wasn't a lot. It was like I almost want to say it's like now that I'm like already like now I'm finally feeling the effects of like how stressful that was. Like it's a couple years later, I'm like, wow, that was a lot. And it's not like we're picking up any pieces. And it may just be other stresses of life, like switching jobs several times and um, things like that. But like I don't, at the time, like I didn't, it was just on to the next thing. This is what I'm doing right now. I got to get the kids to the hospital. Like, and my wife and I kind of were like, all right, let's just give each other a break. We're going through a lot. So like that would have just added more if we're biting each other's heads off. And we really didn't. So now that it's over, you start to like elevate problems that may have been there, but it's like you may get in a small argument over like parenting styles, or you may get in a small argument over financials, which looking back, like at the time, we were just like, no, that's not that big of a deal. Like we just got to get through this part. We made it through that pretty well. It was just, I think after the fact, it was like, whoa, that was a lot, right? Now it's settled. What do we do now?
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing. It's just like this. That's what I kind of uh, realized last year when I was going through all my stuff too. It's like you have so much stuff to do in life, especially with kids, right? Because I know you have three kids. I have
Yeah.
three boys. Going through those motions on a day to day basis, it's like when I was talking with Drew last week, one of the things that I kept or one of the things that I would go back on was like I mentioned to you pre-recording was when I first got sober, you learn all these little quips and all these little things to kind of help you handle sobriety. And they have these little speeches or these little spiels that you kind of pick up on. And so far, when I was talking with Drew and some of the stuff he was going through, and now talking with you, I see some of those statements in daily life. Like yours was, what's the next indicated step? And that's the same thing when you're first
Mm-hmm.
getting sober. What they teach you is that, okay, what's the next indicated step? How do you stay clean through tough times? Is you just what's the next indicated step? You keep moving forward. And that's kind of what I'm hearing like you were really going through was just, look, I don't have time to dwell in this because I have three kids. My son needs a ton of help. I have a wife that I have to kind of keep together for her own sanity because I'm sure emotionally it had to have
Mm-hmm.
been rough on her.
Well, and vice versa, right? Because she could see it in me. I mean, we just kind of had to be there for each
Right.
other, right?
Oh yeah. And
Yeah.
I remember the COVID stuff, and we didn't even have it tough when my youngest was born. We just had to deal with the COVID stuff. Because when he was born, he had a clean
Mm-hmm.
bill of health. Yeah, he was 3.5 weeks early, but everything was smooth with him. But it was the same thing with COVID because he was born in 2021, where the hospitals really hadn't cleared COVID protocols yet. So it was the same thing.
Yeah.
I had to like shuffle my kids around with uh,
Yeah.
my wife's cousin and then my parents and juggling all this stuff around. And that was only 3 days. But it was just, I didn't have
Right.
time to relax from the exhaustion until we got home. The kids had gotten home. Then we could kind of settle in because everything was semi normal again. But to do it day in and day out for a year that had to have
Mm-hmm.
been rough. And how did it kind of,
Yeah.
once you kind of got through that, and now that I know you kind of said that you're reminiscing about those times and just thinking about, holy crap, how that must have been a ton of shit that I went through and kind of coming through it. But how did that experience shape your current outlook on life and the appreciation of life, knowing that, I mean, and like I said, my middle son just had jaundice, so that wasn't even that bad. But to go through the tough
Mm-hmm.
problems like you went through to where you didn't know. I mean, there were probably times
Yeah.
where you were like questioning, like, is he going to make it through this surgery? Is he going to go? And And the
For sure,
emotional
yeah.
structure, like now that he's made it through and you see him playing sports, you see him being active, how does that shape your current outlook on life? And kind of a follow up to that, how does it shape your outlook on society and kind of what everybody's going through?
Mhm.
I mean, I try and keep away from the news as much as possible, but even so, I hear my kids, they're still doing those lockdown drills. They're going through some stuff. They're asking me questions. So, how does it shape your personal outlook on life? And then how does it shape the way that you treat society in kind of what you're teaching your kids?
Mm. I mean, I'm no expert on this, but it certainly taught me to save my stress for problems that are really problems,
Hmm.
right? Like, just as an example, like if your wife gets an offender bender, like I may have in the past before all this happened, just really stress about it and think that's a huge deal. And now it's just kind of like, well, that's just something that happened. Let's just get through it, right? Like, our little issues at work. There's just more important things. So I think ultimately it helps because you're able to focus on the things that are really important, right? Like if I got a call right now that a kid needed to get picked up from school, I would hang up on this podcast and I would go do it because that's the most important
Right.
thing, right? So like focus on it allowed me to focus on the things that are really important and not stress about little things because it could always be worse. And although, Jess and I went through something that was, I hate to use this word, but mildly traumatic. Like people are going through a lot more than that, and you hear the stories, and maybe you run into somebody in the grocery store and they're just having a tough day, and like they're giving the checker, a hard time. Like you just never know, like what happened to that person earlier in that day, or earlier in that month, or earlier in that year to like make them act like that, right? So like just kind of giving people the benefit of the doubt, and just not just like I said, giving people the benefit of the doubt and going from there. So I think that's something that I've learned because I certainly may have had times where, I'm on a work call and it may not be appropriate to talk about my son's, mental stuff, but I'm just not all quite there. And I'm not as into the call as I should be, or an email, I may have come off like a little aggressive or something like that. Like, um, there's reasons that that happened because I was going through this, right? So like when I see something like that coming my way, I'm like, well, maybe that person's dealing with something that they just don't want to talk about right now. So like, let's just give them the benefit of the doubt and shake it off, right? So like my kids, you asked about teaching my kids, like kids can say some really mean things.
Hmm.
And if they come home and they're bullied, or what my wife and I like to tell them is like, you don't know what that kid's going through, right? Like there may have been something, you know, their mom may have been very frustrated before they got to school that morning. There may have been tears in the house. They may have not eaten breakfast. Like there's a lot of other things that could have caused that aggression toward you. You just kind of have to be kind, right? And that's easier said than done because God knows I can be unkind at times, but I mean I think that's something that I've learned, and certainly something that I try to think about. Not that I'm perfect at executing it, but I guess that would be my
Yeah,
answer.
and it's good because it's like it seems like trauma has kind of shaped some parents in very similar ways. I mean, like you were exactly talking about with the bullying.
Hmm.
Like I remember, I think you remember. I can't remember if it was seventh or eighth grade. Like Tony Perkins and I, right? We had that kind of battle,
Yeah.
and it was the same thing. Like my parents taught me, you don't know what he's going through, and obviously he was living with his grandparents, and he was going through some rough times in there. So him bullying
Hmm.
me, it was just I made my way through it. And the same thing happened to my
Hmm.
son a couple weeks ago, my oldest. He didn't want to go to school. I think it was a couple Fridays ago. And it was because on Thursday there was a kid that ran into him and kind of bumped into him and said something, and my son said something back and he shoved my son. My oldest was kind of freaked out and he was like, I really don't want to go. And I explained literally exactly what you had just said. And I expressed it to him based on my experience, based on what we had gone through. And sure enough, we forced him to go back to school that Monday. And he walked up and the kid apologized to him because he had gone through something
Yeah.
that day. And so you're right and it's really tough in society today because regardless of what political side you're on, everybody in the
Mm-hmm.
mainstream media from eh, I'll just focus right now on the political side of things. Both sides are just the way that they talk about each other is we're giving these kids an approval that, hey, if you're if you're senator or if you're House of Representative or whoever, whichever side you're on, whoever's running for president, they're talking about somebody else in a certain way. And we're watching it, and us as adults, and I was guilty about it
Mm-hmm.
in the past. I've since kind of changed my tune significantly since my kids got older, but we spout that same stuff too. And then it immediately gives our kids
Mm-hmm.
approval to say, hey, that means that's okay for me to talk that way. And then when we go through some tough times and we want something, we would like somebody to kind of be there for us or help us or give us some sort of advice or some sort of communication to let us know that it'll be okay. If all we see out in the world is nothing but chaos and people fighting and people arguing, there's no sense that life will get better. When I was talking with Drew
Yeah.
last week, because he teaches a bunch of high school age kids, he teaches them to prep for uh, college auditions for actors. And I was
Mm-hmm.
kind of talking to him about that. How does that generation view society in the political world and just kind of how everything meshes together? And he was like, oh, these guys just do whatever, these kids just do what they want because whenever they see the news, the world is burning. And so in their minds, the world is burning
Yeah.
down. So let's just live every day like it's your last. And while that's a good mantra to live every day
Mm-hmm.
like it's your last, because that it keeps you running, especially with stuff like you've been through, how understanding how precious life is, it's not you
Mm-hmm.
shouldn't do it in a way that like you shouldn't do it because the world's burning. And to kind of hear the
Right.
different
Right. Right.
dynamics and then see my oldest go through it and then hear kind of your conversation the same way with kids just being mean, it's really difficult to kind of sit there and just and hope for a better future. But I'm hoping a podcast like
Mm-hmm.
this or communication like this can show that, hey, even though the world is burning and that might encroach into your own life, whether it be through the stuff your son was going through or the stuff that you and your wife were going through personally or the stuff that any of us have gone through that I went through last year, that there's still a glimmer of hope, right? Bringing hope back to the
Yeah.
world because as much as the politicians might say it, as much as your priest might say it, as much as your parents might say it, unless you experience it yourself, it's really difficult to say, oh, yeah, I trust you that if I elect you or if I go to church or if I trust you, it's really difficult to say that everything will be better, especially when you're going through tough times.
Yeah.
So, as we kind of wrap up
Yeah.
here, what if you
Mhm.
had somebody, yeah, a friend of yours or a colleague or anybody you knew that was going through not just a rough time, let's say they were going through the same thing you've gone through from a emotional standpoint and from an outlook standpoint, what piece of advice would you kind of give to somebody that's going through a rough time even if it's not the same thing as yours, what kind of advice would you give to somebody that's like, the world's just burning around me, all this shit's going bad, life is not working out for me, life is not where I
Mhm.
want it to, so I'm just going to give up, or I'm just going to curl up into a ball and hope that things get better. Like, what advice would you give somebody to keep moving on and keep moving forward?
I mean, two immediate things come to mind. I mean, the one the one that's easier is to just take some time for yourself as much as possible, right? So I wish I had done that a little bit more when Augie was in the hospital, but just really whatever it is you like to do. Like I obviously like to golf a lot. I wish I had gotten out a lot more while that was happening. Just get a babysitter for the other two and just go take some time for myself. I think that's really important. Whether it be just go on a walk, physical exercise is really good. Drinking lots of water is really good. As much as possible. I mean, you mentioned sobriety, like staying away from the intoxicants because that's only going to
Mm-hmm.
make things worse. But that's easier said than done, obviously. Um, and then, the other thing that's a little bit harder is you got to talk about it. I mean, you have to like find somebody that you trust. It doesn't necessarily have to be as public of a forum as we're having right now, but find somebody that you trust, whether it be a therapist, your spouse, your parent, just open up about it because a lot of anybody that you talk to may have gone through something similar. And sometimes it helps, sometimes it doesn't, but at least you've gotten that off of your chest and told people how you feel. And I think that's probably the hardest thing to do for a lot of people because we're just ingrained to be strong and protective of our feelings but I just think it's really important. So I wish I had done a lot more of that during the time. But since then, doing things like this, talking to people and just opening up about it, like it's helpful. So those are the two immediate things that come to mind. And grass is always greener once you get through it,
Yeah,
right? So like it only makes you stronger. And that's a hard thing to hear when you're actually going through it.
exactly.
But it really does. I mean, it really at the end of the road, you'll come out
Yeah,
of it better.
yeah.
So
No, that's definitely what I realized last year was no matter how much people say, "Oh, just hang in there. It's gonna get better. It's gonna get better." When you go through days and days where it's not better, you start to give up. But you have to realize that
yeah,
whether you believe in a Christian God or a Buddhist God or a Hindu God or whether you're atheistic and just believe in the universe, there is something else out there that it's going to be on that time. You can't control anybody else's. One
yeah,
of the things that I
yeah.
really learned was you can't control anybody else's emotions or decisions. You can't control
Mm-mm.
anyone's but your own.
Right.
And so you really got to have to take a look at, yeah, things are going tough and yeah, it seems like it's never ending, but eventually it will. Eventually something's going to turn itself
Mm-hmm.
around and you're just going to get to a point where then you can take that step or you can take that breath and more time to
Right.
yourself. I mean, it's definitely important during chaos to have some time to yourself. You'll get some more reflective time to yourself like you have. And it's great
Right.
that you've
Right.
been able to come on here and talk to us about everything that happened, and we hope that you definitely share that with others. And we'll have to do some sports stuff down the line so we can talk about lighter days. But
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
I thank you
Yeah.
for being on, and this is very informative. It was very good to kind of see the vulnerable side. Like you said, it's emotions, especially male
Yeah, man.
emotions, have before it was really frowned upon, and now even more so that again, some public figures out there that are more that act real strong-willed and I never cry, I never do this, I'm never weak. It really
Right.
for men to come out and just share their vulnerability is not easy in these times. So thanks again for coming on, and
Yeah.
I'll
Yeah.
let you go. I know
Yeah.
you
Of
have
course.
a meeting coming up, and we'll definitely have to set this up again down the line. And If there's anything else, feel free to share it.
All right. I'm good. Thank you, Brandon. I
Awesome. We'll
appreciate you
talk to you
having me
later,
on.
man.
All right. Take care.